Prayer by the chaplain.
Let us pray. We come before you, Almighty God, conscious of our faults and failings, but confident of your love for us. Come to us, remain with us, enlighten our hearts and minds. Give us light that we might know your will and the strength to make it our own and to live it in our lives. Guide us by your wisdom, support us by your grace, embrace us in your love, for you are our God, living and true. You desire justice for all. Enable us to uphold the rights of all, and do not allow us to be misled by ignorance or corrupted by fear or favor. Unite us to yourself in the bond of love, and keep us faithful to all that is good and true. In all that we do, may we temper justice with love, so that all of our decisions may be pleasing to you and earn the reward promised to good and faithful servants. We ask this of you, one God, living and true, forever. Amen.
The chaplain for today is Reverend John Bauer, Basilica of St. Mary, Minneapolis, Minnesota. Pledge of Allegiance. Please remain standing and recite the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
The clerk will take the roll. Clerk will close the roll. A quorum is present. The clerk will read the journal of the preceding day.
Journal of the House, 47th days, St. Paul, Minnesota, Wednesday, May 1st, 2013.
There's no objection. Further reading of the journal will be dispensed with, and the journal will be approved as corrected by the chief clerk. Hearing no objection, the journal is approved as corrected by the chief clerk. Reports of standing committees and divisions. Copy of this order of business has been placed on each member's desk. If there's no objection, the reports will be adopted. Hearing no objection, the reports are adopted. Introduction and first reading of House Files. The following House Files have been offered for introduction today. The Chief Clerk will report the House Files and give them their first reading.
Introduction and first reading of House Files 1815 through 1821.
First reading, House File 1815 to 1821. Message from the Senate.
Message from the Senate. Mr. Speaker, I hereby announce the passage by the Senate of the following Senate files herewith transmitted. Senate File 250, 346, and 723, and 748. Signed, Joanne M. Zoff, Secretary of the Senate.
First reading of Senate Files.
Introduction and first reading of Senate File 250, an act relating to family law. Ellen moves that Senate File 250, House File 252 now in the General Register, be referred to the Chief Clerk for comparison.
Hearing no objection, so ordered.
Introduction and first reading of Senate File 346, an act relating to crime. Hillstrom moves that Senate File 346, House File 411, now in the General Register, be referred to the Chief Clerk for comparison.
Hearing no objection, so ordered.
Introduction and first reading of Senate File 723, an act relating to higher education. The bill is being referred to the Committee on Higher Education, Finance, and Policy. Introduction and first reading of Senate File 748, an act relating to commerce. Lane moves that Senate File 748 and House File 654, now in the General Register, be referred to the Chief Clerk for comparison.
Hearing no objections, so ordered. Calendar for the day. The first bill on the calendar for the day is Senate File 843. The clerk will report the bill.
Senate File 843 on the calendar for today, the second engrossment, an act relating to local government.
Representative Nelson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'd first like to substitute the House language for the Senate language.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Nelson moving to amend Senate File 843 to second engrossment as follows. Delete everything after the enacting clause and insert the language of House File 1196, the first engrossment. The amendment is coded DEA 1196.
Any discussion to the amendment? Seeing none, all in favor say aye. All opposed, no. Motion prevails. There are no other amendments at the desk. The clerk can give the bill its third reading.
Third reading, Senate File 843 as amended.
Third reading. Representative Nelson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. House File 1196, Senate File 843 is basically was brought to me by the League of Minnesota Cities. It's a fairly technical bill, and it's about allowing them to use websites and defining what a trade publication is. The way the current law is, the only trade papers that they could use is printed, and they couldn't use the websites. And the construction industry is moving more and more to websites to list the jobs that are going to be bid on, the list of specifications. By doing this, we're saving our cities money by allowing them to use these websites and put their bids, post their projects up on those websites, because they don't have to pay to put them on the website, where they have to pay to publish them in the trade papers. And this just allows them to do this. It redefines what trade papers is to include those websites. And I'll stand for any questions.
Any discussion on the bill? Representative Pepin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We just passed an amendment. I haven't seen the amendment, so I'm not sure what we passed with the DE1 amendment.
It's to insert the House language for the Senate language.
Thank you. That's what I assumed. Would Representative Nelson yield to a question?
He will. Representative Pepin.
Thank you. Representative Nelson, we heard this in committee, and I think my concern was just that when it was before, in current law, it's a newspaper and trade publications. But your language now says a newspaper or trade publications, so there would be no requirement that there'd be a publication in a local newspaper. Is that correct? Would you yield?
Representative Nelson.
I believe that is correct, yes. And just so you know, the Newspaper Guild, the Newspaper Association does support the bill. They're on board with that.
Representative Pepin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Representative Nelson, continue to yield.
He will. Representative Pepin.
Representative Nelson, I think I asked this in committee, and I don't know if I had an answer on. I did get an email back on the web sites. I think there's 3 that are used, but I don't know how many hard copy publications are considered recognized industry trade journals. Do you have that list, or do you know what that is?
Representative Nelson.
I don't have Mr. Chair, Representative, or Mr. Speaker, Representative Pepin. I don't have that list. I have a list of 3 websites, and I believe that was what was emailed to you. But there are less and less of them are trade publications that serve the building trades. They're being published. They're going more in the industry to the websites to do this work.
Representative Pepin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And would Representative Nelson continue to yield?
He will yield. Representative Pepin.
Thank you, Representative Nelson. I think I'm okay with this, but one other concern that I had is of the 3 websites, the Department of Transportation website looks like anybody can get on, but the other 2, the first 2 that are listed, Quest CDN and Demand Star, you have to be a member to sign in. Do you know what that membership involves? Is there a cost? What I'm concerned about is maybe small companies that don't want to pay for a membership. Do you know if there's a cost, or how would you become a member?
Representative Nelson.
Mr. Speaker, Representative Pepin, I don't know what it takes to become a member, but in the construction industry, if you're going to do that work and get in the bid process, you have to go in those places and be able to get at those documents, and that's where they get them at. So that's part of the cost of doing business, and that would be part of their bid cost.
Representative Pepin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I just have one other question, if you would yield to a question.
He will yield. Representative Pepin.
I went in the Quest website, and it said on the list, if you have to be a premier member, and then you can browse and search a comprehensive list of current projects. So if we were to pass this, would they be listed even if you weren't a premier member? I'm not sure. I'm guessing that's some kind of a monetary amount. If we pass this bill today, would these be printed even without being a premier member?
Representative Nelson.
Mr. Speaker and Representative Pepin, I believe so. It's the cities would be putting them on. The cities aren't the people that are being charged a fee to put them on there. It would be the people that are wanting to bid on the contractors that would be having to pay that fee. The cities, I do not believe, are charged that fee.
Representative Pepin.
Thank you.
Any further discussion on the bill? Seeing none, the clerk will take the roll on the bill. The clerk will close the roll. Barrett votes aye. There being 100 ayes and 22 nays, the bill is passed as amended and its title agreed to. The next bill on the calendar for the day is House File 195. The clerk will report the bill.
House File 195, the first engrossment, an act relating to health.
Representative Loeffler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. House File 195 allows licensed dietitians and nutritionists to adjust medications as long as they adhere to a protocol or practice guidelines adopted by the prescribing physician. This is a current authority and law that's granted to nurses, physician's assistants, medical students, or residents or pharmacists, and it's a belief that in drafting the underlying law, it was just a mistake not to include them. The typical common areas in which a nutritionist or a dietitian might use this authority is in helping someone with diabetes understand how to manage their insulin with their diet. Also, it's used for people who receive tube feedings or IV nutrition. And as I say, this is generally believed to be an oversight in drafting. It's not encountered any opposition as it's moved ahead, and I would appreciate your support.
There are no amendments at the desk. The clerk will give the bill its third reading.
Third reading, House File 195.
Third reading. Representative Abler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. This is one of those matters where the law hasn't caught up with the practice. I believe it's clean and ready to go, and I urge members to vote yes.
Any further discussion? Representative Hoppe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would the author of the bill yield to a question?
She will. Representative Hoppe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Loeffler, I think I heard you say that there's no opposition to this, and my question was going to be, is there any opposition? Is that, if there's no opposition, then I'm happy to vote for it. I just was curious. Thank you.
Representative Loeffler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and Representative Hoppe. That's correct. There is no opposition to this bill. Like I say, it is likely an oversight in drafting the underlying statute.
Seeing no further discussion, the clerk will take the roll on the bill. The clerk will close the roll. There being 121 ayes and 1 nay, the bill is passed and its title agreed to. Representative Erickson, for what purpose do you rise?
Point of personal privilege, Mr. Speaker.
State your point of personal privilege.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. Today is National Day of Prayer and also the Day of Prayer here in Minnesota. At your places, you have a resolution that was authored by persons on both sides of the aisle, and it is available for your pleasure to read, and I invite you to join the group that will be presenting a worship service, Heart of the City, on the Capitol Mall between 11:30 and 1:30. I think they would like us to gather there about 12:30 to receive intercessory prayer, which is the theme this year, members, intercessory prayer. And I think we know, all of us, whatever religious background from which we come, that prayer is very important in our lives. Thank you, members, and thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The next bill on the calendar for the day is House File 1390. The clerk will report the bill.
House File 1390, number 1 on the calendar for the day, the first engrossment, an act relating to state government.
Representative Kahn.
Mr. Speaker and members, House File 1390 is really pretty much of a technical bill that just updates the language in the Geospatial Information Office, which is a very important office in state government in terms of making sure that the geospatial data is in one place, is accessible to counties, and is also incredibly useful for things like flood control. In other words, being able to interpret it how high rivers may rise and what the by knowing what the bluff lines are. I do have an amendment to the bill, Mr. Speaker.
There is an amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Kahn moving to amend House File 1390. The first engrossment as follows. The amendment is coded A3.
Representative Kahn.
This amendment clarifies that government entities sharing data on the subdivision must specify any redistribution restrictions that they have beyond government entities. It also states that a government entity receiving a request for shared data from a non-governmental entity must direct the requester to the authoritative data source, the original entity which will have the most up-to-date data.
Any discussion to the amendment? Representative Holberg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Representative Kahn, I'm afraid of the result of this, adopting this amendment may be that we put data classification into the hands of this board or individuals as far as the use by the public of this information. And so can you tell us what the data restrictions are, if any, on this data set, and if all the information would remain public unless the legislature says otherwise?
Representative Kahn.
I don't think that it might be something like the private name on a piece of property, or it might be something like a dispute on who owns a piece of property or something like this. All this really does is just says that if there's a request for further distribution of the data, it needs to go back to the original authority. Instead of having that decision made at the state level where it might not be known exactly what restrictions are and how reasonable they may be. I mean, what this is not an original purveyor of data. This is just this is just the final kind of collection of it.
Representative Holberg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, Representative Kahn, in your amendment, on lines 2 and 3, it talks about them specifying any redistribution restrictions for non-governmental requesters. And I'm assuming that the public are non-governmental requesters. And so I am asking you, who decides what the redistribution restrictions would be for the public?
Representative Kahn will yield. Representative Kahn.
Well, if you look at the bill, it specifically states that the government entities providing data on this subdivision are not required to provide data in an alternate format supplied by the requester. So I don't. So this also then says that if the person who has given the data to the government has a redistribution restriction, then that goes as part of the data.
Representative Holberg.
Well, Mr. Speaker and Representative Kahn, my question was not about the form of the data. It's about who has access and what they can do with it. Your bill is very clear. When government entities are sharing information amongst themselves, they can pretty much do whatever they want. I'm not even sure that with this amendment the bill retains the right of the public even to have access to the information. But what I'm really concerned about is the redistribution restrictions. And in the past, when we have had discussions around this data set, it's an unresolved issue as far as my memory goes, and that's why I'm trying to get from you as the bill author, what are the standards for redistribution in current law, and will this advisory council have the ability to set different redistribution standards?
Representative, Representative Lesch?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, members, I had a conversation with Representative Holberg about this when she saw the amendment after it was posted. Staff had brought my attention to the subject matter of the bill. I said that it did not need to be seen in civil law for various reasons, including that I thought the subject matter was covered enough in government operations. Representative Holberg brought up the context of the amendment as it was stated to me and stated the concerns that she has relayed to you here on the floor as well, saying this really should have been heard in civil law. I think based on what she told me, and we had quite a back and forth on it, I think I'm inclined to agree at this point, despite the fact that I had told staff no previous to this. So it would be my request to Representative Kahn, if you would withdraw this amendment, and we could work on this in a subsequent committee hearing to determine the questions as raised by Representative Holberg. Mr. Speaker, would Representative Kahn yield to a question?
Representative Holberg actually has the floor right now. If you want to let Representative Lesch proceed with his question, Representative Kahn.
Mr. Speaker, I'd be happy to yield the floor to Chair Lesch.
So Representative Kahn will yield. Representative Lesch.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Kahn, would you be willing to withdraw this so we could just vet the language of this amendment to give everyone a little bit less indigestion about it? Representative Kahn?
Yes, I certainly would. I don't think this is a critical part of the bill in terms of what we're doing in terms of the organization of the Geospatial Information Office. So we'll pull. I'll withdraw this amendment at this time.
Representative Kahn withdraws her amendment. There is another amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Pepin moving to amend House File 1390 to first engrossment as follows. The amendment is coded A4.
Representative Pepin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First, I'd like to ask for roll call.
Roll call being requested. 15 hands. There will be a roll call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. The bill is only 2 lines. It simply asserts to reinstate language that was in law because this creates another council with no sunset. And I believe that we should look at every council, every agency. Since we didn't pass the Sunset Commission, we don't have any systematic process. I think the very least we should do is put it in statute each time we pass such a bill to make sure there's a sunset so that we can review it, to make sure that each board is doing what they set out to do. So with that, I would take questions and ask your green vote. Thanks.
Representative Kahn.
Mr. Speaker and members, I certainly oppose this amendment. We do remove from this bill does remove from statute one of 2 geospatial advisory councils. That's the State Government Geospatial Advisory Council, which is now part of the internal minute governmental structure. The sunset date is eliminated to the other advisory council. We're proposing to eliminate the sunset date because MinGeo is required to serve and obtain information from the broader geospatial community in Minnesota on an ongoing basis. And this would be really harmed by a random sunset provision. I mean, geospatial data does not disappear. It is in one place. It has to be kept in one place. And this would be, and the thought that we would propose eliminating the thing which is one of the most useful. At the point when we were doing this, I recalled many of the counties saying how incredibly useful it was to have this one place ability to get geospatial data. And I recall developers also thinking how incredibly useful it is. I think it is really a waste of time for something that's so essential to government to put a sunset date on it, particularly when we can get rid of it at any time that we feel that it's not necessary. So I urge a vote against the Pepin amendment.
Representative Pepin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. I just remind the body that if this is such a great advisory council, then certainly in 3 years when we look at it again, we will extend the time of the committee. Otherwise, it'll just fly under the radar like everything else does, and it'll just continue to grow government. So I think that anything that is worth its weight will be able to survive scrutiny when it comes back to sunset. We'll take a look at it again as time goes by. And so I think certainly if you believe that it's our job to be efficient, streamlined, and control the unnecessary growth of government, then this is the way to go, because it allows us to look at and reevaluate in 3 years where we're at. Things are going to be different in 3 years, and we should see if this office is still necessary. So I see nothing wrong. If Representative Kahn is right and this is essentially important, certainly we'll vote to continue it in 3 years. Thanks.
Representative Kahn.
Mr. Speaker and members, the bill does not grow government. It just reassigns it to a better place in government. The statewide council provides MinGeo a formal mechanism for input for the representation of local, regional, state, and federal government entities, as well as academia and the nonprofit private sector. It's the kind of thing that well, of course it's valuable, so that we'll keep it, but it's actually so essentially valuable and so essential to the working of the state that that there's no, unless you believe that the state should go on and do these things without advice, that we shouldn't even have to look at getting rid of it. The best thing that we did in terms of repealing unnecessary commissions was actually the repealing of the Sunset Commission, which really didn't have any active effect. So I'd urge a no vote on the amendment.
Representative Pepin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and Representative Kahn. Obviously, I disagree with you because I believe it is our job to make sure that government is streamlined, not overlapping. But I lost that argument last Saturday because of, obviously, my side of the aisle doesn't control the House, Senate, or the governor's office. But Representative Kahn, you said that this doesn't grow government. In line 2.8, it says, Geospatial Advisory Council created. If something is created, that means it's growing. And so I take exception with your characterization that this doesn't create something. It does. It creates a new advisory council.
Representative Kahn.
Well, Mr. Speaker, Representative Pepin, you've been here long enough to know the difference between added language and existing language. That is certainly in there. If you look at that language, you'll look at the correction of things like a capitalization. It's the correction of a removal of an S from another word. When I said something is technical, I really meant it was technical. But the technicality of this is that it's so important technically to have this information in one place so it's accessible to everyone instead of having it all over the place. This doesn't create anything new. It just fixes up the language in very insignificant ways.
Seeing no further discussion on the amendment, the clerk will take the roll. The clerk will close the roll. There being 60 ayes and 66 nays, the motion does not prevail. The amendment is not adopted. There are no other amendments at the desk. The clerk will give the bill its third reading.
Third reading, House File 1390.
Third reading. Further discussion of the bill. Representative Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Kahn, can you tell me, in the bill you're repealing subdivision 4 and subdivision 5, and on there, on subdivision 5, it's the fees. How are they going to be funding this? How does that work now that you've kind of eliminated the subdivision 5? Can you just help me out on that piece?
Representative Kahn.
This is now covered, because it's now, as part of Minute, it's now covered with the standard process that Minute uses in terms of the setting of fees for access to data. So you don't need a separate fee setting for this part, because it's now part of Minute.
Representative Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Kahn, when you say part of Minute, can you give me a little clarification on that? And then I have another question on subdivision 4.
Representative Kahn will yield. Representative Kahn.
Okay. Minute is now what we used to call OET. So it is the office. So what we've done is this was actually a bill that was kind of supposed to be passed last year, and we just didn't get around to it. What it does is it just technically, since it goes into the whole thing that is covered by 16E, you now no longer need this separate fee assessment.
Representative Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and Representative Kahn. So when we're talking about subdivision 4, that's still going to be part of OET/Minute, and they'll still be taking care of that, I assume. But then can you also tell me, does this add any FTEs to our old OET folks, or does it do anything like that at all?
Representative Kahn will yield. Representative Kahn.
It probably, as was done with the major OET bill that actually Representative Downey authored, and I was a co-author of, will end up saving money by the consolidation of these things into one office. All of the separate information offices that used to be in separate units of government are now all in OET Minute, depending on where the bill is passing. And the estimate from Representative Downey was that that bill was probably going to save more than $50 million over 10 years. And I think we've already seen savings in this year in the budget, as Representative Murphy remarked in the state government finance bill.
Representative Holberg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will Representative Kahn yield for a few questions on the bill?
She will. Representative Holberg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Kahn, we've had a long-standing value in the state of Minnesota that the taxpayers that have already paid for the generation of government data shouldn't have to pay again to have access to it. And this is one of those areas where I'm not sure that we've resolved. And so when you say that MinIT has the authority to set fees for access to this data, do they have the authority to charge the average taxpayer to look at a map that's generated under this program?
Representative Kahn.
I was thinking much more, I think they have the same authority that anyone else has always had. If you want a Xerox copy of something in state government, you don't get it free. When I was mainly thinking about fees, because that's what I've been involved in looking at projects that generate data, was the fee and the cost that's required to put the data into the system, which is much more significant. And one of the things that we've done, and I don't know if we specifically did it in this bill, is that there is usually a clause in any bill that's gathering data, like the LCCMR bill that we just passed, for example, that there's a general clause that says that any data gathered by that is that a proportion of the project goes to put the data into the MinGeo system. And we've done that. I'm not sure that I followed that we've done it each time, but I think we've done it enough so that it's not a controversial subject.
Representative Holberg.
Well, Mr. Speaker and Representative Kahn, I didn't really get an answer from you. The data practices chapter very clearly spells out costs to individuals for copies of materials, etc. We historically, as policymakers, have set those standards, and I am concerned about a number of things in your bill, but after your conversation with Representative Anderson, I'm still not sure if MinIT will have the authority to charge the public for access to this information.
Representative Kahn will yield. Representative Kahn.
I don't believe this bill changes anything that's gone on before, and I don't think. And as I said, I've mainly been concerned with the issue of the costs of putting the data into the system, which are much more significant than the costs of access after it's there.
Representative Holberg.
All right. Thank you. And then if I might, there's another area of the bill that I'd like some more information about, and that has to do with providing immunity from civil liability arising out of the use of shared data. And the way that you put this into the bill, the way it reads, I think you are giving civil liability immunity even to that agency that provided the data. I think the term you use in the bill is the original authoritative data source. And because your language on lines 25 and 26 include all government entities and agencies sharing and receiving, you could have, at least the way I read it, you could have the original authoritative data source immune from civil liability just by virtue of the fact that they shared it. And I don't think that maybe that is your intent, but if you are the entity that provided the data that caused the problem, shouldn't you be liable for that?
Representative Kahn.
It's hard to see that geospatial data could provide the problem. This is like the data. It's not the interpretation of the data or anything like that. It's really hard to see that an accurate rendering of specific data, and I would say that this is probably the accurate data in the state on almost anything, because it really is done by geospatial methods. It's hard to see how that could be a problem.
Representative Holberg.
Mr. Speaker, I certainly didn't get an answer to my question. I got an answer that basically said it shouldn't be a problem, but I still don't know if the original data, the original authoritative data source is immune from liability. And maybe I can give you an example where you might want to have somebody responsible. What if you had a public utility that had buried lines, say electric or gas lines, and the data that they provided for the mapping was inaccurate and it resulted in an explosion? Would there be civil liability immunity as a result of the language in your bill?
Representative Kahn will yield. Representative Kahn.
It depends whether it was due to the use of the shared electronic geos. So we're dealing with the fact that someone originally gave wrong data. That person is liable, but the government entity and agency sharing and receiving it under this subdivision are immune from civil liability just because of the sharing of the data as opposed to the taking of the inaccurate data. I imagine we have an interesting case that's going on right now about the contractor that hit a fuel line or a utility line in Minneapolis and, essentially disrupted a block for just about a week or so. And the question is, whose fault was it? And the point is, it's not MinGeo's fault. It's the fault of the person who put in the data or the fault of the person who released it.
And Mr. Speaker and members, that's exactly my point. If you look at the language on page 3, lines 25 through 28, it says government entities and agencies sharing and receiving this information are immune from civil liability. And so if the input is sharing, which I believe it is, so if you have a government-owned utility and they share their mapping information about where their utilities are located, they're immune from civil liability. So I think there's a couple problems with this. I'm sorry it never went to Civil Law Committee, but members, at this point I think that this would be enough reason to vote no against the bill.
Representative Howe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And would Representative Kahn yield for a question?
She will yield. Representative Howe.
These are going to be much easier than what you just went through. So these are very simple questions. On line 2.13, can you give me a reason why we would strike statewide? Because I would think that a statewide advisory council would be much better than something that's more locally centric. So if you could answer me why we struck the statewide on 2.13.
Representative Kahn.
I think because whenever we do a law, we don't write statewide into laws that deal to state agencies. It clearly is. I think it was just stricken because it was considered to be an unnecessary name. The Geospatial Advisory Council is set up, and it clearly is a statewide council. When you read the description of what the council is, you don't need the name statewide in it.
Representative Howe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Representative Kahn, I've got one other question, if you'd continue to yield.
She will continue to yield. Representative Howe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Then down on line 218, why did we strike the no more than 20% of members may be employees of a state agency? How come we now, where we had a limit on those folks that would be a state agency, now it seems like they could all be from a state agencies? I would think that we'd want more public input rather than less.
Representative Kahn.
I think because of the need of people of very specialized abilities and understanding, it was thought that that was an unnecessary limitation. When you look at the line above, which describes the membership, I think that won't be a problem, that they'll all be from state agencies. It was just considered to be an unnecessary restriction. For example, a member of for example, for universities, is that a state agency or not? The state university system is, I think, considered a state agency. The University of Minnesota is not.
Representative Howe.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker and Representative Kahn, but I firmly believe that state agencies always seem to have input, and many of our business community are a lot of our good engineering firms out there that are actually doing the work, I think, by this will now be underrepresented on this, and I think that's where the real expertise on this is out in our private sector. I believe that's where it is, and I think this unduly puts folks from governmental agencies on the board. But thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, members.
Representative Drazkowski.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would Representative Kahn yield?
She will. Representative Drazkowski.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Kahn, can you characterize for us the type of communication or coordination that you've had in the development of this bill with local units of government?
Representative Kahn.
Mr. Speaker and members, the bill came as an agency bill from Minute, and there actually have had, particularly in this area of the geospatial data development, they have very close relations with local units of government. But I personally did not, nor have I had any complaint from any local unit of government since this bill was introduced close to the beginning of March. So I think, since they're very involved in this process, I think if they had any introduction to the bill, I certainly would have heard it.
Representative Drazkowski.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Kahn, I appreciated the bipartisan cooperation that you and I shared with the Sunday liquor sale bill yesterday, or amendment, but that's not the case with this particular bill. As a matter of fact, Representative Kahn, if you'll remember, in committee I shared with the Committee in Government Operations some of the discussion, or actually an email that I had received from one of my counties about their concerns about the county governments being cut out of the discussion and the formation of this bill. And specifically they talked about the phenomenon where they would see that the data, much of the data, will be developed actually at the local level and then brought into this Geospatial Advisory Council and the state government entity that is coordinating this. And then they surmised that what is likely to happen is that people will come to this state agency and ask for the data or access the data online and realize over time after going through and accessing data regularly there that really the freshest and real data, the most current and relevant data will be that back in the county, because there will be a time lapse by which this data will be accumulated and actually references to it that won't be accurate. And I do appreciate the metadata part of the bill because it begins to address something. And I think we had that discussion in committee. But there are large concerns among local units of government, not only that you're going to find that people, the users, are going to come to state government and then actually have to go back to the local units of government, but also that they as local units of government will be dictated to by this process and be in a position where there will be a bunch of rules and regulations brought down to them by which they will have to collect and administer and deliver this data to the state agency. So the concern is, and it rises, and I had the same concern Representative Howe did, line 2.18 and 2.19 of the bill, I think is indicative of what we're seeing here and indicative of the lack of local grassroots development of this bill. Maybe, again, members, this is indicative of, here again, the government bringing forward legislation and a government-initiated bill, the government speaking to the legislature, and the legislature standing at attention and ready to write their language into law for them. That seems to be what we're seeing here, because actually on 2.18 and 2.19 we say, you know what, we can have more than 20% of the members be a state agency. So the state agency is saying, we want to be more than 20% of it. And when the spirit of the bill and the spirit of the initiative, which Representative Kahn, I think, is a good direction to go, but I think the bill before us is flawed. The bill does not include local units of government. It is written by the state government to position them uniquely without the input and coordination necessary to make this successful. So while I appreciate the spirit of the bill, Representative Kahn and Mr. Speaker, I'll be voting no and encourage members to do the same.
Representative Kahn.
Yeah. First of all, in answer to Representative Holberg, Minnesota Statute 466 on tort liability political subdivisions already provides immunity from the civil liability problems from the use of geospatial data. This was just putting comfort language in to make sure it's in the same place where you see the existence of the agency. What I'm trying to say several times is that this is really a technical bill. It's really moving something that was apart from minute, OET, and so forth, and putting it into it as we are putting all information systems in one place. There are no change of powers, there are no extension of powers. All of this has been going on, probably unknown to most of the people in this body for many years. Actually, the first start of this was an LCMR project probably 30 years ago to the University of Minnesota, and it was then moved over from the University of Minnesota into state government. So there are really only, most of the language that we've looked at are really technical changes to put it into minute where it belongs instead of having it sitting out by itself.
Representative Zellers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Representative Kahn, yield to a question.
She will yield. Representative Zellers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Representative Kahn, and looking under the section Representative Holberg was referencing, and thank you for the update. And I'll start by saying my expert on this isn't available, so what you may be doing may be perfectly right and actually in line, but my dad's a geodetic engineer and a geophysicist, so he does GPS surveying and GIS analysis for a living. Unfortunately, he's not in the country right now, so I can't call him to see if what you're doing is or isn't right, or also is or isn't going to make it difficult for those private contractors who do collect this data. So my question, Representative Kahn, is if the government entities are immune, whether it's in your bill or the previous enacting language, is that civil liability then, does that fall to the independent contractor that in a lot of cases collects the data, analyzes the data, then sends it to the government entity? Is that civil liability now fall on that private business owner that collects the data, then analyzes it, and sends it to the government entity?
Representative Kahn.
Mr. Speaker and Representative Zellers, if you look at Minnesota statutes 466.02 on tort liability, it's very specific on the tort liability of municipalities and and they are liable for its torts and those of its officers, employees, and actions. So that is the place. If there's a wrong data entered and so forth, that is the place that you go back to, going back to Chapter 466. Which this bill didn't touch. So nothing was touched in 466. There's a lot of language in it. I have the copy here if you want to read through the whole chapter. I didn't really think it was necessary for essentially a technical moving of one agency inside another.
Representative Zellers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, that wasn't really the answer. I guess I can read the statute and see if that's the case. And if it is, your language may or may not be making that case. But what I can say from personal experience is there are times when government entities request data, the independent contractor fulfills the contract base, and because this is GIS, it's GPS surveying along with data analysis, sometimes a government entity that is requesting the data does not request the correct data that they need for the systems. So then the independent contractor who fulfilled the contract exactly by the requirements asked has to go back again and say, well, no, we had the wrong data, you need to have the right data. And that's where the civil part of this, civil liability, and the suit can be brought, or the contractor can actually have to redo the data and in a lot of cases eat the cost of redoing it. So I think, and I'll be happy to look to the statute, but I think Representative Holberg is correct. So this liability is going to be left with the contractor, and if the goal in this is to get just the government to do the surveying for themselves, then I guess that's going towards that goal. But if you actually want to have independent contractors providing this data, but also accepting the civil liability for the government and for themselves, I think that's a bad idea. And your amendment, as you say, may or may not do that. If it's already in statute that way, that's a bad idea, and we have an idea for a bill for next session. But I share Representative Holberg's concerns, because this, to me, looks like you're going to ask those independent contractors, guys like my dad, who are small business owners, accept the liability for the state agencies, when in some cases they request the wrong data and then are given receive a bad data, but then go back to the independent business owner and say, you gave me the wrong stuff, do it all over again. And that is not the fault of the independent contractor, it's the fault of the government, whatever agency it may be, requesting the wrong data. But like I said, if my dad was in a phone, near a phone that I could dial, I'd call and ask him if you are doing the right thing, Representative Kahn. Maybe you are, I don't know, but my experience with him and his work with not only private sector but also public sector government entities, it seems to me that this would put more of an onus on the private business owner, and I think that's a bad idea, especially again if they don't know in a lot of cases what they're requesting. So, Madam Speaker, or Mr. Speaker, I would stand with Representative Holberg in that I don't think this is a good bill to vote for.
Representative Kahn.
Mr. Speaker and members, again, going through Chapter 466 under the exceptions, which is the exception of the tort liability, one is one of the exceptions on execution of the statute is any claim based upon an act or omission of an officer or employee exercising due care in the execution of a valid or invalid statute, charter, ordinance, resolution, or rule, which seems to me to give adequate protection for the misbehavior of an entity. Again, I'm repeating, this is really, unless you've had a lot of complaints about what's happened with geospatial data, and it is interesting, one of the things that happened in the budget a couple of years ago was that Governor Pawlenty had a proposal in his budget to totally eliminate the funding for this entity from the budget. There was such an uproar from local units of government that he actually withdrew that. We didn't have to withdraw it for him. He withdrew it himself. If any of you would talk with your local unit of government instead of just looking at things to pick on the floor of the House, I think you will find very strong support of this MnGeo service and find that they very highly rely on the data in the form which it ends up in this agency.
Seeing no further discussion, the clerk will take the roll on the bill. Clerk will close the roll. There being 70 ayes and 56 nays, the bill is passed and its title agreed to. Representative Murphy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. I'm going to move a recess to the call of the chair, just a little bit of the lay of the land for the day. I would expect that we will be off the floor for about 90 minutes. I know there are some that want to go to the National Day of Prayer event. DFL members, we're going to go into caucus in room 217. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I move a recess to the call of the chair.
Representative Sanders.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just an announcement to GOP members, we will be caucusing immediately.
To Representative Murphy's motion for recess to the call of the chair, all in favor say aye. All opposed no. Motion prevails. The House stands in recess to the call of the chair.